The Stand. What could I possibly say about The Stand?
You're a wordy little bastard, aren't you?
Yeah, that'll do it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Indie Book Review, where today I am not doing an indie book, but instead I am covering The Stand by Stephen King. This is a classic book. I've read it before back in high school. Loved it then, wanted to see if I still enjoyed it as much, especially since I recently did Swan Song, and these two books are often compared to one another. And, Swan Song being my favorite book of all time, I really wanted to actually see if this book really did compare, or at the very least was at least close to being as good. Well, is it? Let's find out. So I suppose the first thing I should actually talk about is the plot of the book. So it's kind of split into three parts. The first part is basically detailing the virus, the apocalypse that causes the end of the world. And this is a virus that has a 99.4% communicability. I think that's the right word. Basically, 99.4% of the population can and will catch this virus. And it has a 100% mortality rate. That's book one. And it follows, the main characters, Stu, Larry, Franny, and Nick, as they go about, surviving the apocalypse and all the shit that they have to deal with. Then book two is basically dealing with the dreams, the road to either Mother Abigail with, in the case of Stu, Franny, Larry, and Nick, but also some people going through the Dark Man in Las Vegas, primarily Larry, who I guess is with him kind of at the end of the first part, technically, but also Trash Can Man, and the stuff that he goes through getting to Vegas. And book two also, or part two, book two, whatever, also has the good guys off to Boulder, Colorado as well, and the committee and their attempt at reintegrating society within the survivors of the United States. And then book three is everyone the main characters going to Vegas and what happens going on there. Basically, their last stand against the Dark Man. This book is big. It's 1,141 pages. At least my copy is 1,141 pages. This is also the complete and uncut edition, which is it's really hard to find the actual, original edition of it. I'm sure I could find it, bookstores. Well, not major bookstores, used bookstores or, Amazon or whatever. I could probably find the original version, but this one does the trick. This is also the one that I read in high school, so it's what I'm going with. There are parts of the extended bits that I really didn't think needed to be there. Stephen King mentions the whole confrontation with Franny and her mother. That really wasn't entirely necessary. Yes, it does hold a little bit as to who Franny is, and her relationship between her and her mother and her and her father. But for the most part, the scene really didn't go anywhere. I can see why it was cut. But then there are some bits that are absolutely phenomenal. There's an entire chapter of just people in the aftermath of the virus dying in all sorts of different ways because they just don't know how to survive. They don't know how to cope, they don't know how to survive. Some of these people are kids. There's one girl who falls off her bike and cracks her skull and just dies. There's one kid who falls down a well and breaks both his legs and dies of starvation, shock and exposure. There's one guy who dies due to a heroin overdose because he's not used to, 90 whatever percent cut. One guy gets bit by a rattlesnake. It's actually a really interesting chapter while it doesn't hold anything toward the plot, it does build the world. That is something that I really enjoy. And there's one scene with Trash Can Man. Well, not even a scene. It's an entire chapter with Trash Can Man and this character called the Kid. The Kid apparently was not in the original text, which is interesting because it's kind of I mean, it doesn't really hold a lot into who Trash Can Man is, but it does give a little bit more flavor into his journey. So in terms of scenes added, the extra stuff does actually add a lot. There's a little bit that really doesn't, but for the most part, it really does. But there is one major flaw that comes in with this. Stephen King decided to up where the plague takes place. Instead of being in 1980, it takes place in 1990. And for the most part, it really doesn't play that much of a role, but there are times where it's really noticeable. Especially with Larry and his music industry, because it doesn't really talk much about artists past the mid-1970s. Like, it's got a few references to it, and it's got a few references to some 80s stuff, like Freddy Krueger, Madonna, and not Led Zeppelin, Van Halen. But those are usually just in passing. Going into, like, Larry's entire music career, I have a hard time believing that all these 60s and 70s people are the ones that really got Larry going, or the ones that Larry was really into. I've got a feeling Larry would have been into more of the 80s pop. The Duran Duran, the Tears for Fears, Soul Asylum. I think Larry would have probably been into that. Maybe, like, I wouldn't say he'd be into, like, the hair metal or anything like that, but given who Larry is and the kind of music that he does, also, there's a lot of casual racism in this book. I can't really just skirt that one. Like, it's very obvious. And it's not always the bad people saying, like, dropping the N-word. Or, you know, there's a few times where Stephen King just straight up says, the boy looked at him with his china eyes. It's like, no, you can't say that. I'm off topic. That was something that was, like, really, really, really noticeable and really pulled me out of things because, you know, 21st century sensitivities and just, you know, what is actually right. Yeah. I'm not going to say Stephen King needs to go and rewrite all this stuff, but it's pretty obvious as to when it was written. Because some of that stuff was a little more okay back in 1976 when he originally wrote it. Not so okay in might not have been as taboo in 1990 when it was re-released, but still. I'm not saying he needs another re-release or anything like that, although it is Stephen King. You never know. There's also one other spot where I'm like, yeah, I doubt that was okay in 1990. And that's when a doctor told a pregnant Franny that, yeah, a nightcap is okay, just don't drink to excess. I doubt that was okay in 1990. I doubt that was okay. I mean, if it was, yeah. But far from that, it doesn't really lend too much to it. It's hardly noticeable for the most part. But let's talk about characters. Are these characters believable? Are they good? Yes. These are actually very well written characters. There are some stereotypes, particularly when it comes to mental illness and stuff like that, looking at Tom Cullen. But for the most part, it's really not that bad. Like, I've definitely seen worse in books, if that makes it okay. For the most part, I'm really, like, what is really good about the characters almost makes up for the few bad things. And while that doesn't entirely make it okay, it does make it a little less abrasive. Like, Larry is a very interesting character. Stu starts off not very interesting, but gets better as the story goes. Nick is interesting the entire time. Franny is not very interesting throughout the entire book. Seriously, I have no fondness toward Franny or animosity in any shape or form. She's just kind of there. Let's see. Tom Cullen, fun character, a little problematic. Ralph, he's a country guy from Oklahoma. That's his character. Glenn Bateman, he's a university professor. That's his character. For the most part, the characters are well written, but you can definitely see which ones got more love and more time put into them. How about the villains? Trash Can Man is kind of in the same ballpark as Tom Cullen. Very mentally ill, very unstable, and is kind of treated somewhat as a joke, but kind of not at the same time. Larry is a very interesting character, and despite not being particularly fascinating at first, gets to be even better as time goes on. The Darkman is very, very boring. Randall Flagg is probably the worst of the characters in this book. Like, he is just boring. He's not intimidating when he's actually on the page in any way. Except for, people saying just how scared they are, or, he dare not look into his face lest he go mad, or something to that effect. Like, other than that sort of stuff, when Flagg is there and he's talking, he's just not very interesting. Especially later on in the book when he starts losing some of his power and he starts having massive temper tantrums over that sort of stuff. Like one of the good guys kills themselves because they were getting interrogated, and Flagg just flies off the wall. And I really wanted a really good villain. And it turns out the humans were the better villains than Flagg ever was. And it's because the humans were at least interesting. Flagg was not. And his entire, even at the end, if you haven't read The Stand or seen the movie, tough shit. I'm going into spoiler territory. I don't care. The book's been out since the 70s. The extended one's been out since 1990. The movie's been out since the mid-90s. I'm getting into spoilers with this. So, the whole thing with Trash Can Man and bringing the A-bomb to Vegas. Yeah, Flagg not only went full whiny bitch, but he completely just pussed out and has absolutely no power over anything that's going on in his world. That is not a very good villain. I think Stephen King might have just wrote himself into a bit of a wall going, I don't know what to do with this, so let's just have Flagg slowly start to lose power. He's not going to be as much of a threat anymore, and he's going to be kind of whiny now? Oh, and we're going to blow him up with an A-bomb. No. Bad, Stephen King. Bad. Now let's get into Mother Abigail. She is probably I said Flagg was probably the worst character, but Mother Abigail is a very close second. Other than the whole dream thing, she plays absolutely no part in this story. She gets the people together, and then she fucks off for a little while. Then she comes back very briefly, saves them from an explosion, which, Deus Ex Machina. Talking about Deus Ex Machina, I'll get to the end again later, but yeah, she comes back, saves them from an explosion because she comes back, and then sends them off to Vegas to die. Yeah, Mother Abigail, not a very good character. I don't care that Stephen King went into her backstory and spent a whole chunk of time during this one thing in 1902. I don't care. I didn't care when I was reading it. I really didn't. But this is what we got from her. I know it was intentional to make us feel a little bit more for her, and so we get to know who she is as a character, but I really just didn't care. And the more she was on the page, I just cared less and less. She was the most interesting when she was by herself getting those chickens and having to face off against the weasels. That was her being interesting. Once people started showing up, she was no longer interesting. The last interesting scene Mother Abigail was in was when Nadine showed up, and she had this whole this whole vision epiphany thing when it came to Nadine. Other than that, other Abigail, just not an interesting character, like, at all. So, characters, despite having some very, very strong characters, there are some exceptionally weak ones. But let's get into, say, the writing. Like, this book is not little. There is a lot of writing in this. Is the writing any good? Yes, for the most part. Stephen King has this whole thing. And it's not just in this book, it's in a lot of his books. He has this problem where he just doesn't get on with it. He will go on and fucking on about whatever the hell he wants to go on about without getting on with it. And after the 5th or 6th or 9th page of him going on about something, I no longer care. I just want to get on with the story. Because there's only so much that backstory actually matters. And I say that tentatively. When you are doing it like Stephen King does it, there's only so much of it that matters. In general, backstory is very important. Unless it's not important to the story, then don't bother bringing it up. Mother Abigail's backstory, for example, not very relevant to the plot. It played absolutely very little into the story as a whole. But for the most part, the writing is actually really good. Like, once Stephen King gets on with it, holy crap, does it actually, like, draw you in and you really know what's going on. A lot of the stuff with the plague, like that first book, he really doesn't get on with it very well. Part 2, he gets on with it, but there are a lot of detours along the way. Part 3, holy crap does he get on with it. He doesn't mess around at all during that climax. Until after the A-bomb goes off and Stu and Tom are getting home. Then he kind of goes on and on and on and on and on with it. But at the same time, there's a purpose there. I'm willing to forgive it. Because it is played for a purpose. So let's get to that ending, shall we? But I guess you should really ask, which ending? Because this book gives The Lord of the Rings a run for its money in terms of the amount of goddamn endings it has. Like, okay, it's not even really so much endings, it's just closing plot threads, I suppose. First off, you have the Vegas. You have everything going on in Vegas. And that A-bomb, which was set off by the hand of God. I mean, talk about an actual literal Deus Ex Machina. Yeah, an actual God in the machine. I hated it. I hated it when I was a teenager reading it. I hate it now. Genuinely hate that climax to that plot story. Because he could have done so many different things with it. Their journey could have meant actually something. It could have been an actual test for God's protection. Flag cannot harm them. The people of Vegas cannot harm them because of the journey that they took. That would have been so much more of an interesting and compelling ending than God blows up an A-bomb with it. God blows up an A-bomb. But okay, so we've got that bit out of the way. Now we've got Stu and Tom's way home. Now, Tom's whole role in the story is to be there to stop Stu from dying of pneumonia on the way back. Nick's whole part of the story is to die and come back as a ghost or a spirit or an angel or whatever and guide Tom to show Tom which pill Stu should take. So Stu doesn't die from pneumonia on the way back. And then there's the whole drive back. And it's not even really a drive back. They get some snowmobiles, they go for a little while. Then they get some more snowmobiles and they go for a little while longer. And then they walk, and then they finally get there. And it's so goddamn long. There's so many pit stops along the way. And I get it. It's meant to show that they had a long, hard road right back to where they want, right back home. It makes the journey all that much more worth it. It makes getting there so much more cathartic for the reader. I get it. But god damn, this is the one time I really wanted Stephen King to just get on with it. Actually, it was the only time in the third part where I wanted him to just get on with it. Because everything else was perfect. But then getting back home wasn't the end of it. No, there's got to be the whole thing with the baby. Which, yeah, okay, they got to tie up that plot end. And show that Captain Trips might kill a few of the babies that were conceived before Captain Trips to two or to one non-immune family member. It'll kill some, but others will survive. So okay. And then Fran wants to go back to Algonquin. Okay. And then they leave for Algonquin and stop at Hemmingford home. Okay. And then it's revealed that Flag's still alive and going to restart with a bunch of primitives. And then it ends. And I'm just like, oh god, please just let this end. And it finally ended, and I was exhausted from just how many freaking endings there were. I was done. I was just done with the endings. Like I said, it gives Lord of the Rings a run for its money. It was unnecessary. Their stop at Hemmingford home could have completely been cut and no one would have known the difference. It didn't add anything. At least I don't think it added anything. There was a conversation between Fran and Stu that probably could have been added a little earlier, and it would have added just as much. The entire stop there just doesn't mean anything. All in all, what kind of a score would I give The Stand? Honestly, despite all my ragging, despite everything that I said about it, I still would give this book a 4 out of 5. It is really compelling. It's really interesting. When Stephen King manages to actually get on with it, it's very, very good. It's just having to get on with it and having to sift through some kind of mediocre characters to get through to the really interesting ones. Also, I didn't go into how many people died or who dies and why they die and so on, so far like that. So if you haven't read this book and have gone on this far, I do recommend reading it or listening to it on Audible. It's like 48 hours long. You got to do what you got to do. But do I recommend this book? Yes. Cautiously, though. It does have some problematic language to it. It was written back in a time where that was okay. And yeah, The Stand, I'm going to give this book, a 4 out of 5, where I suppose I would give it an actual 7.5 out of 10. Because I do things out of 10. A 7.5 out of 10. It was good. It's got a lot of flaws. So yeah. Wow, that was a lot to get through. I will have another review out next week. Yay! More reviews, more books. It never ends, man. It never ends. But I got through it. So. If you like what I do and want to hear about me being an author, my books, my processes, the advice that I could possibly give on how to be a better writer, check out my channel below. Otherwise, just be sure to check in next week for my next book review. And as always, see you later.